It's not every day that we get a new headphone from Sennheiser, unless it's 2025, in which case it's just about every day that we get a new headphone from Sennheiser. Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review. And these are Sennheiser's new HD 550 and HD 505. At least I think I got those correctly, because yes, this year Sennheiser has released two new headphones that are very, very similar. I would say 95% the same. And if you're confused about the difference between them, so was I. And that's why I reached out to my homie, Joe at Gadgetry Tech. And I asked him if I could borrow his headphones, because he did a review of these headphones. If you want to check out his review, I'll have them linked in the description down below. But I was really curious to find out, what is this last 5% difference between these two headphones? Is it meaningful? And then how does it compare with the previous headphone in this lineup, which is this one, and down here, which is the HD 560S? Well, for the past week or so, I've had these headphones on loan, been listening to them, comparing them, and I think I'm ready to let you know what I think. I guess before we get to that, shout out to Joe again. I've got him linked in the description down below. Subscribe to Gadgetry Tech. He does really good reviews of headphones, specifically from like a gaming perspective, which I do a very bad job of. So check him out for that. But with that said, let us dive to the table. We'll talk about what these headphones are, physical form factor, and some differences between them, because that's where I think there's about 5% difference between them. And then we'll talk about also the sound, which is, again, where there's about 5% difference between them. And then ultimately I'll give these things a score and you can make up your own mind where you want to go with them. But yeah, let me just lay them out here on the table and start with this one. Actually, this is a headphone that came out a while ago. In fact, I reviewed it a couple of years ago when it came out. This is the HD 560S. And all these headphones are in basically the same chassis. I guess we'll talk about the physical form factor and stuff like that. But this is, when it first came out, I feel like it was like 200, maybe 225 bucks, but the times have changed, prices have changed, and it looks like the price, the going price on this thing now is closer to $280, at least the MSRP. Although, because it's been out for a couple of years, you can get it for $230-ish right about now on Amazon. Is it worth the upgrade? Well, we'll talk about that stuff in a bit. But the next newest headphone that came out was this one, which is the Sennheiser HD 505. And this one was announced and came out just at the beginning of this year. All right, so not very long ago, and it already has a successor of sorts. But what's interesting about this one is that, as far as I can tell, this one's like kind of an Amazon exclusive. I don't know if it's available outside of the United States. I assume it is, probably with some other retailers, but at least in the United States, when I search to buy this headphone, I can only find it on Amazon. And there's some other things about it that seem like they might be a little bit like it's like a budget headphone for Amazon or something like that. But it is coming in at, I think, the same price as the 560S. I think the MSRP, let me check my notes, is $280. But because this one's new, don't expect price cuts on this thing right away. Although, you know, Sennheiser headphones tend to have price cuts eventually. But there you go. Also a dynamic driver headphone, very, very similar chassis, although we'll get into some physical differences, but not before we talk about this one, which is the latest of the three headphones here, which is the Sennheiser HD 550. And if you're not following the numbers, we went from 560 to 505 to 550. Okay? Try not to think about it too hard. Just think about it as the all black one, the copper one, and the black with silver ring around it. Okay, this is the newer one. So the 550 is the most expensive of the bunch, coming in at, I believe, hold on, let me check my notes. Yeah, $350, which is putting this thing dangerously close to Sennheiser HD 600 territory. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about HD 600 in this review because we've got enough on our plate to talk about, but I will bring in the HD 600 at the end for kind of like a final evaluation. But yeah, this is the latest version of the headphone. My understanding, and I forget where I heard this, is that this is like the copper version. The 505 is like a tweaked version of the 560S. They made some modifications to it and changed the sound a little bit, which we'll talk about. And then this version is supposedly, there's more changes to it. There's like a new driver or something, new baffle. I don't even know. I feel like I heard about this. Maybe it was on the headphones show when they were talking with the folks at Sennheiser, but I couldn't find it in any of their marketing material. So unfortunately, that is about as much detail as I can give you. Of course, we've got the headphones in front of us, so we can talk about what differences there are in terms of physical form factor, which again, like I kind of led with, they're basically 95% the same. There are some small differences, however, and it's not just the aesthetics, but it is frankly mostly the aesthetics. So Let's see. I mean, just to start about all of these headphones, they all come in basically the same chassis. This is the HD Sennheiser 500 series chassis that you've seen on a number of headphones for many, many years. So it's a bit of an old chassis. It's a lot of plastic. You know, it's got decent cup rotation. It's got some, well, you call it a swivel. You call this rotation? I forget. There's like there's some axes there, but it's got decent amount of movability. I'll show what it looks like on my head in a little bit as we talk about comfort. They've all got what seem like the same pads, although this is the 560S, which I've had for a couple of years. I don't know if it's because it's a couple of years old and the pads are a little bit more worn in, that they do feel more shallow than the pads that are on these. And that does also play into the fit and comfort, which is interesting. And then apart from that, what is similar between them? Hold on, let me just check my notes. Okay, let me talk about this. The cable situation, because they all use the same cable, which is interesting. It is, at least here in my hands, this is the one that comes with the 505 and the 550, 3.5 to 2.5 millimeter. That's right. So it's single entry on the headphone. You have a 2.5 millimeter connector here that goes in, and you find the spot, and then you like turn it to lock it into place, which I think is kind of cool from the perspective of it just makes a nice secure connection. Like you don't have to worry about it coming loose or anything like that. But it's a little bit of a bummer from the perspective of this is a not super common cable to find, right? If you're looking for a replacement, you can't even just get any old 2.5 millimeter cable as a replacement because it has to have this locking mechanism, or at least have enough clearance that it'll fit within the locking mechanism, which basically means it has to have the locking mechanism. So when you buy a replacement cable for this, you're probably going to have to look for specifically a cable made for these headphones, which just kind of limits your choices. Not a big deal. Here's what I'll say about this cable, which is interesting because when I reviewed this, the 560S, a couple of years ago, my recollection is that this came with like a 10-foot long cable, which for me was just way, way too long. This, however, is a more practical, I think. It's about 6-foot long cable. Like I can stretch my arms out end to end, and it's about that long. So it's maybe a little bit longer than I would prefer for purely portable use, but I think it's a nice kind of in-between compromise for portable use and desktop usage. So there you go. There's the standard cable. And it's got actually pretty nice behavior on it. I know it doesn't look fancy. It's just kind of a basic silicone jacketed cable, but it's got, yeah, a nice behavior on it. It rotary wraps, as you can see, and it lies flat. There's no stiffness or anything like that. That's a good cable. It is, as I noted, a 3.5 millimeter termination down here at the bottom, but it does also come with a screw-on 6.35 millimeter termination in case you want to plug that into a larger desktop amplifier. In fact, I think this is a nice feeling connector. And I like the fact that it screws on because it just makes it feel, frankly, like it's just, it doesn't even feel like an adapter, right? It just feels like it was made as that. So if that's your preferred connection, you don't have any weird compromises. Apart from that, okay, we're kind of moving into what comes inside the box, although I started ostensibly by talking about what are the differences. Just to highlight briefly, a little sack that comes with both of these headphones, the 550 and the 505. I don't remember what came with the 560S. Again, it's been a couple of years since I reviewed it, but here's a little bag you get for it. So basically the same accessories that you get inside of these two headphones, and also the same 2-year warranty, which I thought was kind of cool. The box that you get with the 505, again, I mentioned that there's some indications that this is like an Amazon special to hit a price point. I'm gonna reach down here and grab these boxes just to highlight for you. Can you guess which one is the Amazon low price point box? That's right, it's this one. So this is the box for the HD 505. But yeah, apart from that, all right, let's get into talking about the actual differences between these headphones, because there are some, okay? Starting with the 560, which is actually the most different. Maybe it makes sense because it's the older one, but there's actually some things about this I like better than the newer ones, interestingly enough. And specifically, it's the headband. I think that this is a little bit more comfortable than the more solid kind of unibody headband that we got here on the newer models, right? This maybe feels a little bit more premium. It's kind of a fake leather, and it's, you know, decently well padded, but there's just something about this simple padding with a little little break in the middle to relieve pressure on the center of the top of my head, that I actually find this just feels a little bit more, I don't feel this headband as much as I do kind of feel the headbands in these two. Now, both of these, or all these, I would say are relatively comfortable headphones. In fact, in some ways, these are going to be more comfortable, because the other difference here is that the 560S is, I would say, notably clampier, right? There is a much tighter clamp on this headphone versus these, which, okay, I think physically when you watch it in the video, it just looks basically the same, but promise you that this has a lighter clamp than this guy. The other difference is, I already alluded to this a little bit, the pads on this one do seem a little bit thinner on the 560S, which just might be because I've had it for a long time and these headphones are relatively new. But what's interesting is that as I'm wearing this headphone, and this is the thing I talked about in my initial review of this, let's see if I can highlight this for you. Inside the ear cup, you see this, like, the structure? I feel this on my ear. And I actually forgot about it when I was wearing these other Sennheiser headphones, but when I put this one on the test and compare, I was instantly reminded. I was like, oh yeah, I feel that thing in there, which is a little bit on the annoying side, to be honest. And again, I don't remember, I feel like, yes, this headphone is older. Yes, the pads probably are not as plump as they were originally. But I do feel like that difference is more than just the plumpness of the pads. Because, yeah, when I wore these, I just didn't even feel it. I didn't even think about it, which when I did my review of this a couple years ago, I do remember thinking about it. So, yeah, there's some advantages with the new stuff. But overall, here's the other thing I'll say I like better about the 560S is just the aesthetics. Now, obviously, this is going to come down to personal choices. But I like the all-black aesthetic of this thing. But I think even more importantly, what I like is just this little touch of raising the area of the grill around the Sennheiser logo. Just kind of elevates it and makes it feel a little bit more modern, whereas these other models, the 505 and the 550, I feel like these look older. These, even though they're the newer headphones, they look older than the 560S to me. I think part of it is just that they don't have that little raised touch, which I think is kind of nice. They also, the 560S has like the logo on the headband kind of off center, which just feels kind of modern and cool. I like that. Whereas on these headphones, it's just kind of the pleather padding all around it. So I don't know, these feel a little bit older despite being newer, but they are also, I would say, overall more comfortable because there's more room in the ear cup for my ears. My ears aren't touching the back of them, and a little bit less clamp pressure, which can't say that I necessarily felt. Okay, anything else to talk about physical form factor? I guess I should show you what this thing looks like on my head. We'll go with the 550. Again, we'll call it the silver one. And yeah, it's a decently comfortable headphone. I didn't really talk about this a whole lot, but like, I don't love the chassis on this headphone, although I will say that these newer ones feel a little bit better. And again, maybe it's just because they're newer and there's less clamp, I don't know, but I don't know. I didn't really like the plasticness of the HD 560S, and it kind of has sharp plastic edges, which I feel like are just as true on this one, although maybe it's not as sharp specifically right here, where it is kind of sharp on the 560S. And maybe that's what I'm interpreting as this thing just feeling a little bit nicer. But it also feels like because the clamp is a little bit lighter, maybe because of the angles on the pads, I'm getting a little bit more even of a distribution of the weight on, or sort of the clamp from top to bottom. Whereas I feel like with the 560S, it wants to bow out a little bit on the bottom, which is interesting. But minor differences. Again, we're talking about 5% differences between these headphones. And in terms of like which I would buy just purely in terms of physical form factor, or which ones I prefer, I think the copper is my favorite overall, just because I like the look of this one a little bit nicer, a little bit more than the 505 or the 550 versus the 505. I prefer the look of the copper 505. Just looks a little bit different. Whereas again, this one looks to me the oldest of the bunch, despite the fact that it is in fact the newest. Okay, but let's talk about the sound on these headphones, because yeah, that's where, again, we're talking like 5% differences, although this is probably going to be the one that's the most different, the 560S. If you don't recall from my review a couple of years ago, this is relatively neutral sounding headphone that is on the thin side. Like, it's got good bass extension. That was part of what this headphone was really known for. Had really nice bass extension, especially for an open back headphone, especially for a Sennheiser. and also like pretty nice imaging, right? The Sennheiser HD600 series, which I alluded to earlier, is not really known for presenting a really wide stereo image, but I feel like the 560S actually surprised people by doing that in a cheaper headphone, which is cool. The one thing that kind of holds this headphone back is that it is a little bit thin in the mid-range. It sounds a little bit dry, and there's also a little bit of a kind of a brittle sharpness to the lower treble on the 560S that I felt held it back then, and I feel like in this comparison in particular, that is a thing that still holds this headphone back. I would say that this, of the bunch, leans more toward kind of a thinner, more transparent, clarity-focused sound signature, but they all still have pretty decent bass, but this is going to have the least warmth and the least body behind things like kick drums and stuff like that. You're going to feel it the least here. If you're listening to electronic music that has really deep, low bass and stuff like that, these are all going to do that area of bass pretty well, but I think that this is going to be the one that you feel it the less because it has less mid-bass, less of that mid-bass bloom, so to speak. Whereas the 505, I noted, to my ear, again, here, making these comparisons, these are really, really close headphones, which makes it even doubly confusing that they released two headphones in the span of like a month and a half that have nearly the same name, and just slightly different colors. But there is some slight differences to the sound. And here's what I'll say too, is like, I'm not even 100% sure that these differences couldn't be explained by unit variation, apart from the fact that they have said that this is supposed to be like a different driver configuration. Like, it's not, it should sound different. It's just that the differences that are there could almost be explained by unit variation. I'll just say that. So I would watch some other reviews that are using other units of these headphones to see if my impressions necessarily carry over to other units. But here's what I'll say about these ones is that I found the 505 here, the copper one, to be the most like the Sennheiser HD600, which is kind of my benchmark for an open back headphone at around $300. I found that the vocals are just a little bit more full versus especially the 560S, but also a little bit more forward versus the 550. In fact, you could almost put these on like a scale of like brightest and like leanest and most analytical to warmest and a little bit more reserved, and the 505 kind of fits in the middle of that, which for me actually feels like the better balance. I would say that the 505 is overall my favorite sounding of the three, but you know, there's some pros and cons to them all. I found that the treble on the 505, I found to be just like nice, light, and airy. It has like a little bit of a spritziness to it, which I like. And I think overall it is the smoothest sounding of the bunch. The mid-range, again, it's got a little bit of forwardness to it. So if you like your vocals, you like pulling out that kind of micro texture, maybe even a little bit extra emphasis on there, I think that the 505 does a pretty good job of that, but it's not quite as forward as the HD600, but of the bunch, I would say it's kind of like the closest. I would also say that of the bunch, like to me, this one has just kind of like the easiest sound. It's like the smoothest of the bunch, where this one has a little bit of sharpness and kind of its lower treble. We'll talk about the treble in this one, but I found that the treble on the new 550 also comes across a little bit on the sharp side, depending on what you're listening to. I felt like the 505 just overall comes across generally smoother. It sounds like its treble emphasis is more in the upper treble ranges, more so than in like the lower treble ranges, and that gives it kind of like the smooth, kind of liquid, easy sound, at least to my ear. So let me talk a little bit more specifically about the 550, which the tuning, and I'll pull up the graphs in a little bit. We can compare them. But the tuning on this one is the warmest of the bunch. So you'll see it in the frequency response graph that the vocal is more laid back on the 550. I mean, we're talking a decibel and a half. Like, it's very small difference. Again, 95% basically the same headphones, but it is noticeable. And there's also a little bit more body in kind of the lower mid-range. But what's interesting to me is that despite the fact that this one has kind of like the most lower body or lower mid-range warmth and upper mid-range relaxation, I nonetheless heard this one a little bit brighter than I heard the 505, and I think my hypothesis is that it's the upper mid-range being dropped a little bit is kind of unmasking the lower treble a little, and it's giving it a little bit more of that sharpness, not quite to the degree that we got here on the 560S, but it is nonetheless a little bit sharper and a little bit more I wouldn't say that's quite to the level of being fatiguing, but again, like the 505 just has like a smoothness about it that generally I found more pleasant. Maybe less textured. You might get a little bit more body and texture out of the 550. But I feel like if you're going for body and texture, frankly, I would still just reach for the Sennheiser HD600. Anything else to talk about this one? No, just this one ends up sounding actually a little bit more contrasting, a little bit more V, whereas the 505 sounds a little bit less warm and a little bit more mid-range focused sounding. And then of the bunch, again, this is the 560S is the brighter, leaner, kind of more analytical sound with a slight fatigue on the treble. So let me jump over here to the frequency response graphs real quick, and we'll do a quick analysis of this. If you want to check all these things out, of course, I've got them linked on Squig link in the description down below. These are all measured on my rig with basically the same measurement methodology. And normally the baseline target that I'm looking at is not this target, right? Normally I'm looking at a tilted diffuse field sound signature, but for this comparison, we're going to use the HD600 as the baseline. Again, this is the HD600 as measured on my rig, so this gives you a pretty good idea of how these headphones are different than the HD600. And a big difference that you'll notice with all of them is that they've got better bass extension than the HD600, okay? And then what we're looking at right now is the 505. Again, this is the copper one. But let me go ahead and baseline this to the HD600. I'm also going to stretch this out a little bit to kind of exaggerate the differences, but really to highlight that you see that difference in the bass, right? The 505 does have more bass, but more or less this is pretty in line all the way up to, what are we looking at, like 8 kilohertz. And then here in the treble, you'll see some differences. I will just say that like any differences you see in treble up here tend to take with a grain of salt, because these are the sorts of things that can vary very drastically depending on your ear shape and even just like how you fit the headphone on the rig. And because these headphones are in different chassis, there's going to be some fitment differences that may or may not carry over to your head. But what I will say is it's interesting. There are some patterns here that will show up in the other headphones. And as well that, this backs up my feeling, my sensation that this does have kind of like this, a nice spritzy, airy treble. Although this right here might look problematic, it didn't sound particularly sharp in that area to me. So let me pull up now HD 550 for comparison, which is our blue line. And you can see that the 550's got even a little bit more bass down here, which again, this is all below 80 hertz. Don't expect to hear a giant difference there. I think you will hear the difference versus the HD600, but this like half a decibel here, I wouldn't expect to hear much there. But where you should expect to hear more of a difference, and I know it looks like magnitude-wise pretty similar, it's just why I'm saying this has a bigger difference, this lower mid-range and upper mid-range tilt, is twofold. One, there's just a lot more music content here. Actually, it's maybe threefold. Two, you hear this stuff a lot better, like 80 hertz and below, or yeah, you don't hear very much down there. At least I don't know about your ears. But and then the other thing is that this is kind of like a double whammy here, right? These things kind of play on each other, where you get a little bit more body here in the lower mid-range, a little bit of a drop here in the upper mid-range. And it has the effect of, again, just giving you a little bit more warmth, a little bit more body, and slightly more relaxation in kind of the vocal range on the newer 550, again, the silver version. And what's interesting is that I don't really see a difference in the treble. In fact, you can see that, this area that I was saying is kind of volatile and depends on, rig placement and stuff like that, actually ended up showing up very, very similar between the two. But nonetheless, I'm hearing the 550 as sounding a little bit brighter. And again, my explanation for that, why I think it's happening, is because this is a little bit suppressed. It's kind of unmasking maybe some of these lower treble frequencies and giving it just a little bit more of that edge and a little bit more bite in the 550. But again, we are really picking nits between these headphones, especially these two. And I guess that's probably going to be as much as I can say about these things. Let me just check my notes, make sure I'm not missing anything. No, I don't think so. Out of 5 stars, I'm going to give, I gave this one 4 stars a few years ago. I might demote this one to a 3 just because these two exist, and I like these two better. I think sound-wise, these two are improvements over the 560S. Versus each other, I actually kind of prefer the cheaper, earlier 505. It feels, again, just a little bit smoother overall. And also a little bit more, it offers something more like it. The mid-range I described as being more HD600-like, but neither of these are really HD600. They don't replace the HD600 for me. But what I do like about this one is kind of that, again, that liquid character that I get from the better bass extension and that spritzier upper treble. That gives it kind of like a nice, enjoyable, smooth sound. And so for me, I actually prefer the 505, despite the fact that it's also the cheaper of the two headphones. Although then that is a MSRP. So this was $350 versus $280 on the 505. Their prices are bound to change and fluctuate. And if I'm shopping for one of these headphones, they're so close together that I would just pick it based on which one you think looks cooler and then how much you want to pay for it. That's basically what it comes down to. But overall, I do actually prefer the 505. Of the two, or sorry, for the score for both of them, I'm going to give them a very solid 4 stars out of 5. The biggest downside or the biggest problem with these is they still have the Sennheiser HD600 problem, which is that the HD600 exists and the HD600 is about $300. Like its MSRP is $400. But again, Sennheiser prices tend to drop as headphones are on the market for a while. And the HD600's been on the market for like 20 years. So you can regularly get it for about $300. In fact, as I checked right before hitting the record button in this review, the HD600 is cheaper than the 550 right now on Amazon. So, well, actually, sorry, this one's not even on Amazon, but you get my point. That said, that is my review of these headphones. If you want to check them out, I will have them both linked in the description down below. This one will be on Amazon, this one probably on headphones.com. And if you like this video, well, hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell. Join me on Discord, which I've also got linked in the description. Shout out again to Joe, subscribe to him. And then after you've done all that, I guess I'll catch you on the next super review. Cheers.
Join with the force of reviews. We now have the tools to brave the misleading world of audio fools. Hey, this review is super, and so are you. Grab your headphones, sniff a graph, and share your thoughts in this pursuit. Let's get into the future.